Okay, boys and girls, this is the third and final video on the human reproductive system, and today we'll talk about the female anatomy. Um, so, the female, we'll start on the inside and work our way to the outside, which is what we did with the males. The female genital tract begins with the ovaries. These are the two gonads, the glands that produce not only sex hormones for the endocrine system, but also eggs. The ovaries themselves are located inside the abdominal cavity, and they are connected to the rest of the genital tract by two oviducts. These are long tubes that pick the eggs up at the ovaries and carry them down into the uterus. And fertilization typically takes place inside the oviducts. The oviducts lead into the uterus, which is the normal site of implantation and fetal development. In other words, this is where the baby develops as pregnancy goes on. Below the uterus is a very strong sphincter muscle, which is known as the cervix. And the cervix is essentially a muscle that closes and opens up when or during childbirth, so that the baby can pass from the uterus and then out through the vagina. In terms of the reproductive tracts, the vagina is known as the birth canal because that's the passageway that the baby uses to get from the uterus to the outside world. But the vagina also serves as the copulatory organ of the female. Okay, this is where intercourse takes place. Okay, so what does this all look like? Well, let me get my ugly mug out of the way here. And so here you can see both a side view, a lateral view, and a frontal view. So this is the ovary here. And then the oviduct is this long tube that leads this way. All right, very similar in structure, by the way, to male anatomy, except that obviously the ovaries are not held in testes. But you can see these little finger-like projections here. Those are called fimbriae, and they kind of move around and they suck the eggs up into the oviduct. And so then the egg travels from the ovary all the way down the oviduct. If fertilization is going to occur, it's going to occur somewhere in here, and then eventually the egg ends up in the uterus where implantation occurs, if the egg is fertilized. This very strong muscular organ is the uterus. The cervix muscle is found here. This is the sphincter muscle. And then the vagina is located here. Okay. Now, notice that the opening for the vagina is not the same as the opening for the urethra. All right, this is different in males and females. Okay, the urinary bladder is here, and it leads out through this tube, and the vagina is a separate opening. Okay, in males, remember that the urethra carries both semen and urine out of the body. Okay, the rest of this back in here, this is the end part of the large intestine and so on. So it's really only the front portion of this that you need to be concerned with in terms of the reproductive tract. Now, the external anatomy in females, you have very sensitive mouths. This here is called the labia minor. On the very outside is called the labia major. And these are simply folds of connective tissue that essentially cover the openings to both the vagina and the urinary gland. The glands, crying out loud, the gland's clitoris is located here, and that is the stimulatory organ, if you will, of the female, very closely related to the gland's penis in a male. All right. So the external anatomy of a female. The labia major, this is again starting from the outside and now working our way in. The labia major are two large folds of fatty skin found outside the opening, the entrance essentially to the female reproductive tract. The labia minor are found inside the labia major, and these are two smaller folds that contain inside the openings to both the urethra and the vagina. The mons pubis is a patch of fatty skin located just over the labia major and covered in coarse hair. You find a similar structure in males. And then finally, the clitoris is the erectile organ. Okay, and it's the site of intense sexual feeling. This is the clitoris and the glans penis are the two most innervated structures in human anatomy. That's the most sensitive structures in human anatomy. Now, it's time at this point to get into the cycles. All right. And in females, we talk about the menstrual cycle, but in reality, the menstrual cycle is divided into two different cycles, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. Now, we'll talk about both, but realize that they're not happening independently. They're happening in sequence with one another. So the ovary itself contains a lot of follicles, all right, each of which contain an immature egg. All right. At puberty, most females have somewhere between 300 and 400,000 follicles, but only one matures every month for the, let's say, 30 years or so that a woman can bear children. All right. From the age of, we'll make this easy, from the age of 15 to 45 is about 30 years. And if there's a cycle every month, that's 12 times 30, which is about 360 eggs. Okay, and it may be a little longer for some and a little shorter for others. All right. Males, on the other hand, are producing somewhere on the order of 1 million to 10 million sperm a day. All right, so it's a very different strategy that the different genders use. Now, one follicle matures each month from the time a young girl hits puberty until menopause, which is happens in late middle age. And is the end of both of the ovarian and uterine cycles. So the cycle itself starts and ends at ovulation, all right, when there's a release of an egg from the ovary, when a follicle bursts open. Now, this diagram shows that cycle, but I want to caution you, not all of these stages happen at once. This is an artist's rendition, okay? So only either the primary follicles or the secondary follicles or an oocyte will be found in any given ovary at any given time. All right, but we start here with the primary follicles, and each of these contains an egg, and they begin to produce estrogen and release it. If the egg becomes the chosen one, it will develop into a secondary oocyte, and the way that it does that is it undergoes meiosis, all right, or at least the first step in meiosis, and we produce a secondary oocyte and what we call a polar body. The polar body is discarded and lost. Now, the secondary follicle will eventually become an oocyte, an egg, surrounded by a big follicle. And that follicle will continue to grow and notice it surrounds the cell with a whole bunch of other littler cells that are support cells. At ovulation, the oocyte itself literally bursts through the ruptured ovary wall and enters into the oviducts. And what's left behind is called the corpus luteum, which is essentially scar tissue. But that scar tissue is now producing not only estrogen, but also a hormone called progesterone. Okay, and eventually the corpus luteum will degenerate and the scar will heal up. Now, sometime after ovulation, the egg undergoes meiosis II to form the zygote, the egg, and the second polar body. All right, this is actually not true. This is the egg, not the zygote. All right, so get rid of that. All right, now, so what happens during the ovarian cycle? Well, this is the formation and the release of an immature egg. It's controlled by gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, which is released by the hypothalamus found directly beneath the brain. There are two phases here: the follicular phase, which we'll start with, and then the luteal phase. And each of them takes around 14 days. So the whole cycle is about 28 days, almost a month. So during the follicular phase, the hormone FSH, remember that one? Follicle stimulating hormone, promotes the development of the follicle, and the follicle itself secretes the hormone estrogen. Now, at about day 14 or so, a spike in the amount of estrogen leads to a surge in LH, or luteinizing hormone. Remember that one? And that leads to ovulation right about halfway through the ovarian cycle. After that, we enter the luteal phase, and the LH now promotes the development of the corpus luteum, that scar tissue, which then is secreting now progesterone. And progesterone has its own role that we'll talk about in a minute. Now, if pregnancy does not occur, then the cycle ends after 28 days and menstruation begins. Now, the uterine cycle is also a 28-day cycle. It runs right along the same time frame. It's synchronous with the ovarian cycle. In days 1 through 5, there's a very low level of estrogen and progesterone, which causes the inner uterine lining or the endometrium to break down. It disintegrates, and it's shed out through the vagina. This is what we call a woman's period. Now, at about day 6 through about day 13, we enter what's called the proliferative phase. During this point, there's estrogen now being formed by the new follicle, okay, and being put into the bloodstream, and that causes the endometrium to thicken. And this occurs, the endometrium gets thicker and thicker and thicker until about day 14, when in the ovarian cycle, remember, ovulation occurs. From day 15 through day 28, we enter the secretory phase. And in this case, the corpus luteum is producing progesterone. And that causes the endometrium to double and triple and maybe even quadruple in thickness in preparation for the developing embryo, assuming fertilization has occurred. Now, if the egg is not fertilized, the corpus luteum, the scar tissue in the ovary, begins to heal up. It shrinks, it disintegrates. And so there's no more progesterone. And if there's no more progesterone, the endometrium goes bye-bye. Okay, and that's what leads to the period. This slide kind of shows both cycles at the same time. Notice, in the uterine cycle, this represents the thickness of the endometrium. So on, come on, day 1 to 5-ish, the endometrium is being shed, and so it gets thinner and thinner and thinner. But from day 5, where the follicle has begun to develop, now estrogen is being produced, and the endometrium begins to increase in thickness all the way up through about day 14, when ovulation occurs. Once ovulation occurs, now the corpus luteum is secreting progesterone, which increases the thickness of the endometrium even more, until the corpus luteum begins to heal up, which then leads to a decline in the thickness of the endometrium. Okay, and so you can see the hormone levels, especially the spikes that occur day 13, 14 here in LH, FSH, and estrogen, all lead to the ovulation. Okay. Now, that, my dear boys and girls, ends our discussion of the reproductive system. As always, if you have any questions, please send me an email. Please make sure that you read the chapter on the reproductive system in your textbooks. And there will be a quiz on this stuff on Monday, the 28th, 7th, 27th. Okay. So have yourselves a happy Monday and look forward to the next series of videos on the development of a fertilized egg.